Perfect. Well, it's great to spend some time with you again. My name is Adam, one of the leaders here at Pinehurst Community Church, and today I'm hoping is being the word, to wrap up this little bit that I've done of Romans 9, 10, 11 outside of our Sunday morning meetings to try and give it some attention. However, Romans 11, as you'll find when we get into it, is one of those passages where there's probably been more discussion and more disagreement as to what it means than probably most other passages in the entire Bible. So, whilst we may go through it today, you may come out of this with more questions. And if that's the case, can I encourage you, keep going back to the Bible, keep looking up other resources. Please come and ask me. Maybe there's some recommended reading I can give you, because I've spent some time reading, researching, preparing for this, looking into this, and it's fair to say that there is a number of things within here which might be difficult to understand. Now, some of them you might think when we get to the end of them, how relevant is it to me in a Christian life? Some of them maybe more so than others. For some people, they may take this to be almost a pet subject of theirs, and everything else revolves around this. So my hope is that when we've looked at this together, we'll end up in the same place as Paul as he writes this letter, which is a place of worship. As sometimes we can go through these things and all we end up in a place of disagreement, a place of actually that's become more important sometimes than Jesus himself. And that's not what we want to do. We want to get to the same place as Paul does at the end of Romans 11, which is a place of worship. And so the reason it's complicated, or partially complicated, is because it once again picks up on the subject of Israel. Now, Israel is a subject which even today causes major, almost sometimes arguments amongst Christians as to how important Israel is. How important is Israel? What is the future of Israel? Is there any importance in the land? Is there any importance with the ethnic people who refer to themselves as Israel, or not? And this is something that has been going on through the years and the centuries, and it is still going on today, trying to figure this out. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to look at this passage together, try and ask some of the big questions, and then see where we get to. But as I say, hopefully we'll get to a place of worship. So let me just read out the first bit of Romans 11 for us. It says this: I ask then, did God reject his people? By no means. I am an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham, from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. Don't you know what Scripture says in the passage about Elijah, how he appealed to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I am the only one left, and they're trying to kill me. And what was God's answer to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. And if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. What then? What the people of Israel sought so earnestly, they did not obtain. The elect among them did, but the others were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, and ears that could not hear, to this very day. And David says, may their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. So first of all, we pick up a very similar type of argument to what Paul has been using so far throughout chapters 9, 10, 11 of Romans. Remember, the point of this was the new church, and the new church, much like the worldwide church today, is mainly made up of Gentiles. Remember, Gentiles were the people who were not the Jewish people, who were not ethnically Israel. So that is probably, for most of us watching this, we would be what would be classed as a Gentile. Okay? And so Paul was writing this letter to help the Gentiles and the Jewish people how to interact to each other within the church. What that looks like, how that looks like, because for the first time in history, the Gentiles outnumbered the Jews within God's chosen people. And so how are they meant to interact together? And so we pick up this again once again, Paul said, did God reject his people? Because you can imagine, as they were reading this letter in the church, they'd have been asking questions, particularly the Jewish people. Did God reject those people? The people that we read throughout the entire Old Testament, has God rejected them? Don't forget, we've already been told so far that Jesus himself was the stone that caused some of them to fall and to stumble. But it's only people who believe in him. We've been told that actually it's through saving faith in Jesus Christ that people who call on his name. We've been told these things, and so Paul again is reiterating what he is saying. No, God has not rejected his people. And I think sometimes here we read this and we read this wrong. Did God reject his people? Because we're reading, did God reject all of his people? Well, no. What he's saying is, well, God hasn't rejected everyone who calls themselves Israel, because as Paul says, I myself am an Israelite. I'm a descendant of Abraham, and I'm saved. So therefore, God can't have rejected everyone who called themselves Israel, because God has saved me. And also, at that point, there have been some who would have been in the church within Rome who would have thought, well, yes, that was my background. I'm a descendant of that, and I now know God through faith in Jesus Christ. So God didn't reject those people who we foreknew. So once again, already, Paul is trying to help the Israel see that God has not turned his back on Israel forever. Because Israel can come to God. He then links it to an Old Testament story, talking about, well, look, this has happened before. And in a moment before, when he talks about this story with Elijah, God actually sets himself apart 7,000. So not everyone, but some. So even within Israel, within the Old Testament that we read, and the Jewish people would have read, there were moments where God didn't save everyone, there were just some. There was a selection or a remnant, as the word is used here. There was a remnant that was saved. A remnant means there will be some that will be saved. A selection that will be saved. So God hasn't rejected all those people, just like he didn't in the Old Testament. But there is a remnant that is chosen by grace. And if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. And this is the message that Paul has been getting over time and time and time again. This is not about how much you do. It's not about how many festivals you celebrate. It's not about how good you consider you are, how much you give to charity. It's nothing about that at all. It is purely based on the grace of Jesus Christ. The fact that he went to the cross. The fact that through that, you can come to him freely and find forgiveness and acceptance by grace. You don't have to earn your way to the cross, as we looked at last time. You do not have to do that. All you have to do is confess with your mouth and believe in your heart. Because grace has done the work. Jesus has done the work. And then he once again goes on to quote more Old Testament passages, saying, what do we do then? The people of Israel so earnestly did not obtain. We saw this last week, didn't it? What Israel sought to obtain, they did not. And what the Gentiles sought not to obtain, they obtained. Once again, he's going over the same arguments. Some of them were hardened, but some of them have obtained it. And we read previously, didn't we? Not all Israel are Israel. And so this is where we have to be careful. We have to not overclaim something that may not be there. And we looked at how maybe within Israel itself there is a remnant or a spiritual Israel. Those that actually know God through faith, not through works. But then Paul goes on to talk about this interesting story. So far he's really just recapping some of what he's already told us, or what we could already have picked out from the text before. And then from verse 11 he tells us a little story and gives us a picture. He said, once again with one of these rhetorical questions, again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentile, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? I am talking to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles. I take pride in my ministry, in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and to save some of them. For if their rejection brought reconciliation to the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this: you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by your faith. Do not be arrogant, but tremble. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God. Sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise you also will be cut off. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. After all, if you are cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature are grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Here we have this story, this picture of this olive tree, a tree which would have been much more relevant to this people in this Middle Eastern culture than it might be to us here in a slightly different climate here in the UK. But here we have a picture, because once again we're trying to figure out, have these people, these Israel as they were known as, ethnic Israel, fallen so far as beyond recovery? He's taken it a step further. So did God reject his people? No. Okay. But he has partially rejected some of them, but have they stumbled so far that they can't recover? No. And he tells us why. He tells us, well, actually, as part of salvation history, this is what I'm going to do. And actually, we looked at some of this the other week, where it was prophesied in the Old Testament that actually the Gentiles have come along, with the nation that was not the nation have come. And what is part of salvation coming to the Gentiles meant to do? It's meant to make the Jews envious, that the Gentiles have received the promise of God. Because up until this point, the Jews saw this as their promise. They were God's special people. But now what we find is that there is this ingrafting, there is this moment of these other people being allowed in. And the idea that this would make Israel then envious was something which would hopefully bring them back one day to God. And Paul likes to talk about it through this picture of this olive tree. And he does it so that the Gentiles won't boast. He's doing it so that the Gentiles won't be able to sit there with their Jewish brothers, those that believe in Jesus, have found faith through him, and turn around to him and say, how ridiculous you are that you've missed this. Because that is not what should be happening here. He wants them to see that actually you have just been grafted into something that is bigger than yourselves. He's trying to help the Gentiles see that the story did not belong with you. He refers, when he talks about the olive tree, he doesn't say the whole olive tree is uprooted and new things were planted. We are told that the root supports us. We have been grafted into the story at a later point. Salvation has always been there through faith in God. And to remain part of the olive tree, you have to have faith in God. But what he is saying is here, for those of us that are Gentiles who maybe have been grafted in because we weren't part of that God's chosen people in the Old Testament, we should not be ungrateful of the history that has gone before. Very practically, that means for you and I, we need to understand the history. We need to get into our Old Testaments. We need to understand the root that supports us. That's what it tells us. If your Christianity starts at Jesus, the moment of his incarnation, of his birth in this world, and that's all you know that point onwards, you're missing something. Because you need to understand the root that supports you, the patriarchs, the law. We need to understand these things. They don't save you, but they are the root that supports you, that help you live by your faith. It's important to understand these things. Let's not miss this. And so we can't be coming up to these if you would be someone who would be classed as a Gentile, to someone who is a Jewish person and be arrogant towards them. Because the reality is the story is bigger than you. It's by grace you've been saved. You've done nothing. You've been grafted in. But what we can also read here is that branches were broken off from some of these people who were not standing by faith. They were broken off because of unbelief. So they may call themselves Israel or Jewish, but actually they are not saved. And we need to be careful of this. But then Paul goes on further to talk about this even more, because he talks from verses 25 onwards, and there's one verse which has probably caused more controversy than all the other verses together. And I'm going to do my best to start unpacking it with you as best I can. First of all, he says, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery. What this mystery is, we don't know exactly. Probably the relationship between Jews and Gentiles in the church, how that works. He says, I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. All Israel will be saved. This sentence, these few words, are the very words which have caused difficulty, have caused confusion, have almost probably caused war in some places over what this exactly means. Now, we can't forget some of what Paul has already told us. He's already told us different things. He's already told us something like not all Israel is Israel. So not all people who are born ethnically are actually Israel. Because remember, a few weeks ago I talked about it's not about race, it's about grace. Okay, not all Israel is Israel. But we do then read about here there's a remnant from within Israel. So from within the ethnic Israel there is a remnant. There will be those that are saved within Israel itself. So then it seems very contradictory that here we go, some of Israel will be hardened in part, and that's going to happen until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. So is Paul now saying, well, not all Israel is Israel, but all Israel will be saved? Or does that contradict what he is saying? And this is read in a number of different ways. Is here Israel ethnic Israel? Is he here referring to the church? What exactly is Paul coming in? Well, let's try and answer some of the questions and try and dispel some of the myths as to what he is not talking about. What we do know, Israel has experienced a hardening in part. We see that today already, don't we? Some of Israel, those that would call themselves ethnic Israel, has received a hardening in part. Not all of them, they didn't recognize Jesus. We can agree with that. We can see that. We can go, yes, I get that. I can get my head around that. Until the full number of Gentiles has come in. We can see some of that. We can see as the church has spread, as that has happened, Gentiles have come into the local church. That links in with the story just before, the grafting in on the olive tree. All of it is coming together. So we can get that. And in this way, and once that has happened, all Israel will be saved. So what is he saying? Is he saying all Israel will be saved? By that he means, well, when you've got the Jewish people together and the Gentile people together, and you find the real Israel, they will be saved, or something else? Or is he saying this is a future event? There are still Gentiles coming in. And when the Gentiles have come in, the number that I have foreseen, the number that I have elected, once that has happened, there's going to be a future event where Israel is saved. And is that Israel ethnic Israel, or is it something else? I personally read this like this. Israel has experienced a hardening in part. Past tense. Jesus came along, they didn't recognize him. We are now in the moment where the full number of Gentiles is coming in now. And once we get to the end of that, whatever that looks like, I believe, and even now it's happening, there will be many Jews who turn to Jesus. Because I think what we have to be careful with here is something known to some as bicovenantalism, which is basically saying there are two ways to salvation. I don't believe what Paul is saying here is all the Jews will be saved because they are ethnic Israel and they're God's chosen people. But also, you can be saved through faith in Jesus Christ. I think when you look at the book of Romans as a whole, he clearly points to the fact that it is through Jesus you are saved. That is the only way. I don't think we can get away from that. But what I think there will be, by trying to get our heads around this, is there going to come a point where there will be a number of Jews who come to saving faith in Jesus. Exactly how and when, I can't answer. But I think what we've also got to be careful is what it is not saying. Because you will notice nowadays the politically charged nature of the land of Israel and Palestine and around there. I do not believe this Bible text here has anything to say about the land, the geographical location, the political state, or anything like that. I think this is purely a salvation moment. I think if you're going to try and talk about the land or the political state or anything like that to do with Israel, from that point of view, you would need to look somewhere else in the Bible to try and back up those particular claims. I do not believe that is what he is talking about here. I believe he is talking about salvation rather than anything else like that. But then it goes on to say, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob, and this is my covenant with them, and I will take away their sins. As far as the gospel is concerned, there are enemies for your sake. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. For God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. Just as you who at one time disobedient to God have now received mercy as a result of their disobedience, so they too have now become disobedient in order that you too may now receive mercy as a result of God's mercy on you. For God has bound everyone over to disobedience, so that he may have mercy on them all. We need to be careful here. We've had the word mercy on them all, and we read the word all Israel will be saved. I think we sometimes read these thinking it means everyone. I don't think that is what he means here. I think when he uses the word all, he is talking about in general as a group, as opposed to every single individual. So to give you an example, there's a story in the Old Testament where all of Israel apparently sees someone commit a sexual sin. I'm not sure they were all sitting there. It was all done in the eyes of Israel. I don't think they were all sitting there watching this being committed. I think what it means, it was done in sight of the nation in general. And I think that is what he's talking about here. Not everyone will be saved, I think he is saying. But I think what he is saying, God wants to have mercy. God wants to save all. But we cannot get away from the fact that there is an election, that some will respond, but some will harden their hearts. To say anything else would go against other things Paul has said within this letter to the Romans. All of this may be very, very confusing to you and may open up more questions than not. And believe me, I have spent hours reading around this, trying to get my head around it. And in 25, 30 minutes, I can't do all this justice. But what I want to pick out is what I hope will be the main things for us today as we live in light of this message. The first thing is this. I said it at the beginning. Paul ends, read these verses yourself, verse 33 to 36 of chapter 11. He ends in a place of worship to God. When there are mysteries of God, it should end us up in a place of worship. Because it helps us realize that God is bigger than us. And for all the things we don't understand, we can know that he is in charge, he is sovereign. So firstly, even if some of this is going, well, what's that relevant to me? Let it be something which spurs you on to worship. Because worship is the place we should always end up to when we come to God. And secondly, if anything else, what it should mean for us today in the local church is we should be pushing the message of grace more than anything else. Because it doesn't matter what your background, it doesn't matter what you've done, where you've been, it doesn't matter where you're born, it doesn't matter what your heritage is. It is by grace you have been saved, not based on works. As a local church, this is the message that we need to be pushing. If we are grafted in, it is not because of us. It is all because of Jesus. This is where we should get to with this kind of message. If we don't understand it, if we don't get it, for some of you, you say, well, I don't need to know all those details. They're not as important to me as some others. Okay, well, let this be your message today. You're saved by grace. And from that place, come to worship God. For others, you'll want to dig more into it. But as you dig more into it, I hope what you really find is a story of grace. That God has not given up. And like he told us earlier in the book of Romans, it is the mercy we need to focus on of God, not his judgment. So often we can look to the judgment and think, that's harsh. But we need to be looking at God's mercy at this time and how he is merciful. Let's not forget these things as we look to build. Let's not let difficult topics, which sometimes we may struggle to understand, be something that divides us. Let it be something that it can unite us. And even if we take slightly different positions on how we might read this about the future of Israel and about what that might be when it says all Israel will be saved, let us be people who in unity can walk by grace and love of Jesus Christ, walk in the mercy of Jesus Christ, and be people who come to worship because of all that he has done for us, all that we didn't deserve, he has done for us by dying on the cross, by defeating death, by raising again and ascending. Because of that, we can come to worship him. And let us not be people who are arrogant, who think we're better than anyone else because we've received the message and someone hasn't. Let us be humble, but let us be willing to share with everyone we know because we want them to find God's mercy and grace just like we have in our lives. I hope that has been helpful for you today. I hope that has been something which has stimulated some thoughts, some thinking. But I say, if you want to know more, if you want to look into this, please come speak to me. I'm happy to recommend some more resources to you.